Hey Maya.
Hey,
Hey.
good to see you.
You too.
What is this, week three of these?
Yes, yeah, we're getting through it.
I know, we're doing good.
Yeah. How you doing?
Good. Looking forward to this topic. This is another one that I was excited to talk about.
Yeah, me too. And hopefully the technology saves this week.
Yes, fingers crossed.
I was so sad.
I know, because it's just like you think it's gonna just kind of sort itself out,
Yeah. And it's
but
so
it
quick, so
doesn't.
simple, but I changed some settings on my phone so that this time it'll save. Oops.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Well,
Um,
I'm optimistic.
quick um do you want to just do a quick recap of what we discussed the last week since it didn't get to record? Just while people are
Yeah.
still coming to see.
Yeah. So last week we talked about STIs and STDs. We talked about the difference between those two briefly, but really we spent a lot of time focusing on how to slow the transmission, which, of course, we addressed condoms and asking people to get tested and asking our partners how often they've been tested and all of that. But we also talked about STI destigmatization, and I presented some really fascinating statistics about how common they are, to essentially kind of highlight that we can't really attribute negative personality characteristics to having an STI or STD because they're just so common and prevalent, and it's much better for us to bust it wide open, talk about it, and to really not put that stigma on it, to help slow down the transmission.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. And then yep, so have the conversations, guys. They seem uncomfortable, but like once you get kind of in the swing of things, it's kind of just like, why aren't we talking about this?
Right.
Which can segue into today we're talking about sex in the black community. Um I'm black. I grew up like in the inner city. So, inner city schools in urban areas have harder access to getting good public funding, good private funding, and stuff like that. So sometimes the education suffers because there's not enough money put into the school. So
Right.
sometimes like our sex education is kind of like but then like this can be said for like a lot of different like schools in general, just because of like how the education system in America is set up anyway. With like being having a foundation of conservativeness and generally it being like don't have sex until you're married and stuff like that, which can be very harmful when you're growing up because we're not having these conversations with our parents all the time, because our parents are learning from their parents. And I think not, I don't want to say everybody has conservative grandparents, but it's happened in my experience. I know people who have conservative grandparents and they're not comfortable to talk about sex. Um, and I think that's why like we see a lot of teen pregnancies or people not knowing things. You're an intimacy expert. I'm sure people come like they didn't never experience like what intimacy was or something like that because they were it wasn't talked about. They kind of just had to figure it out. And sometimes when you're with someone, you might not know what feels good, or you just do what they say because you don't have an experience.
Yeah, a lot of great stuff there. And I wanted to kind of rewind to what you said about schools and just kind of reiterate what we talked about last week, because given our topic about, sex in the Black community, I think that most of us are aware that unfortunately, STI rates, unwanted teen pregnancy, sexual assault, all of these things are more prevalent within the Black community. But I did want to kind of give some context as to why that is, because unfortunately, so often people just think that, oh, well, that's Black people, they're just struggling, or that's just inner city culture. They just prefer it that way. They prefer the tumultuous type of lifestyle, and that's just simply not true. And so, what you were saying about schooling systems and the funding and how that controls the type of sex educational curriculum that certain populations have access to, and all of that, that plays a major role in all of this, right? Because, like we talked about last week, when the federal funding at certain points in time for school districts is contingent upon teaching abstinence only sex education curriculum or teaching things that are just scientifically not true, um, it's no wonder that unfortunately Black people are disproportionately exposed to information that's wrong or incomplete information, and then have to go out and navigate this world of sexuality and intimacy with misinformation or a lack of robust information. And so the point here is that, if we're talking about sex in the Black community, I don't want to ignore the fact that we have these certain issues in terms of statistics and various social phenomena that are happening within our community. But I really want to be clear and crystal clear that I don't believe that's because there's something wrong with Black people. But there's a lot of social forces at play, structural racism,
Yes.
institutional racism, that make it so that these statistics are what they are.
Yes. And then, that kind of goes into, back to, what I said about why I'm doing this is like making this information accessible. If you come across this and it's stuff like, oh, like I didn't know that, like to some people this stuff is like, wow, like why don't you know? And so I think like as a community, instead of us asking people like, why don't you, like
Mm-hmm.
just be that vessel to someone like, hey, like, did you know this? Did you know that? Have we talked about this? And then, if you are someone who has kids and you get to that point where it's like I should talk to my kid about this, don't be afraid to have that raw conversation, about like anatomy and this is different stuff that goes on because the kids aren't learning it in school. And so another place where that can have someone suffer at is that they're learning from experience with no knowledge,
Right.
and or from their friends, which can be harmful. Or when you brought up with sexual assault, you could be learning from someone that is using that to hurt you.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with what you're saying, including like, how do we talk to the next generation about these topics? And when we're thinking about the Black community specifically, unfortunately, we have a lot of stereotypes that we're trying to navigate
yeah.
as it pertains to our sexuality and how we should interact with one another. And those can really impact how we show up as sexual people, as intimate people with ourselves and with our partners. And so, if we kind of just explore some of those stereotypes briefly, I think we're all pretty familiar with the hypersexual stereotypes of both Black
Yes.
women and Black men. Um, and this obviously can negatively impact our community for a whole lot of reasons. One of which is that we have these stereotypes, and for some of us, we feel as though, okay, that's what it means to be a sexual person as a Black person. That's how I
Mm-hmm.
have to be. I have to behave a certain way, I have to talk a certain way, I have to be something that perhaps isn't me. And so this is one of the negative aspects of having these stereotypes, because we believe that we have to be like the
Right.
stereotypes, right?
Right.
As opposed to going inwards and asking ourselves, how do I want to be as a sexual person? How do I want to be in my intimate life? And those kinds of questions. And so that's why I really do like to talk about stereotypes, because so often we have these stereotypes, we're trying to live up to them, and we're really basing our sexuality and our intimate lives based off these external factors as opposed
Right.
to internal factors. So
Right.
I did want to talk about stereotypes, and I do also want to talk about this kind of pressure that we put on Black women specifically to be respectable women, right? And that has
Right.
everything to do with how we experience and navigate sexuality. I'm sure a lot of us have heard that, the girl down the street, oh, she's just fast. Or we've heard people kind of using these phrases to justify negative things happening to Black women who are just trying to navigate and explore their sexuality, which is completely normal. And we don't put that pressure on people who are perhaps in different racial categories, or at least not to the same extent. So I do
Mm-hmm.
think that it's incredibly important for us to be mindful of how respectability shows up and how we talk about sexuality with Black women, how we analyze or perceive what it is that they're doing, because when we have this really impossible expectation for essentially Black women to never show that they're sexual people outside of their homes, and we shame them for it, it makes it so that, again, we go back to what we talked about before, Jasmine, with the misinformation, the lack of information, as opposed to just having honest, raw conversations.
Right.
Because, again, most people are having sex, most people are at least trying to explore their own sensual life. So to shame people for that, especially Black women, is really a shame and perpetuates misinformation and a lack of information.
Yes. And when we talk about the stereotypes part, I remember for me also that gets into like when you're trying to learn about sex and people or they compare themselves to what they see on pornography
Right.
and not knowing that like a lot of that stuff like it's acting into production. It's meant to entertain you. It's not meant for you to be like, "Oh, like this is what I'm supposed to do or this is what I'm supposed to look like and stuff like that." So just like trying to like understand and see like what things, because sometimes pornography can be educational. Um if you want to like try something new or like, as far as visuals go, I guess, when it comes to, sex. So stuff like that and just like, having to know the facts. I didn't have sex until I was like 20 years old and I had learned from my friends. I had mentioned that last week.
Yeah.
However, some stuff was like, the first time you have sex, penetrative sex, just relax. I learned
Mm-hmm.
something new. I probably, maybe that information could have came from a more credible source because people can tell you anything. But, I relaxed and I had a great time. And usually, people say that their first times are painful, but even little stuff like that, like no one says that, like if you relax, you can enjoy yourself on the first time. They
Mm-hmm.
say like, oh, it hurts so bad and you're just supposed to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to your point about pornography, so I think that that's a really important point to highlight. And the thing is, one, a lot of the free porn that's out there, like you said, it can be violent, it can be inaccurate, etc. I do like to highlight that there are other options when it comes to pornography, ethical porn, feminist porn, queer porn, all of these things that are meant to be actual representations of people's experiences and are meant to also be educational at times. And so I would encourage people who, like you said, do like to engage with pornography and have those visuals to perhaps explore different types of pornography. I think that that's a really important component.
Yes. And also, as long as like you're, watching, the ethical porn, and learning more about that, because that's something that's been new to me. I took a gender and media class,
That's
and I
great.
watched a couple documentaries on the porn industry, and then that changed. I mean, I watched porn before, but I didn't know about the stuff that was going on.
Hmm.
So even in that, porn's not scary. It shouldn't be bad to engage in pornography as long as it's not, being hurt. Like you wouldn't watch someone hurt an animal. So, you don't want to watch and be entertained by porn. Like, yeah, it's free, but everything ain't free ain't good.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, to this point, like, I think we've been exploring a lot of kind of like the STI and unwanted pregnancies and how
Hmm.
we put all this pressure on Black women. But it is really important to me in a conversation about sex in the Black community to talk about the positive aspect and the potentials within these types of connections. Because I do personally believe that sex, just because maybe for some people it's not quite yet a
Hmm.
positive experience, that sex within the Black community really can be a space for healing. It can be a space for pro Black affirmation. It can be a space for connection. And so I really do think that we have the ability to have sexual encounters that come from this very premise of affirming each other, affirming the Blackness and the beauty and the sensuality that comes with who we are, and not policing that in a way where we just are always talking about Black people and sexuality in a negative way. That is one of my pet peeves, when the only way that we can manage to talk about sexuality and the only way that we can manage to talk about sexuality in the Black community is through STI rates and through unwanted teen pregnancy and all of
Hmm.
those things. Because sex does not have to be like that for Black people, and it's not like that for every sexual encounter between Black people as
Right.
well. And so there's definitely a misrepresentation, or at least an exaggeration, of certain elements of how sex operates in our community. So I
Yes.
really do want to flag that sex between Black people can be beautiful.
Yes.
It can be exciting, it can be exhilarating, it can be a way to explore each other. And I do also believe that by having more pleasure in our lives, whether it's especially sexual or sensual or not sexual or sensual at all,
Hmm.
that we are giving ourselves the space to heal from some of the traumas that are inflicted upon us. And we're giving
Yes.
ourselves the energy and the space to rejuvenate, to go back into the world and to try to make it a more just world. So I really think that there's so many more dimensions to sex between Black people besides just the challenges and just telling Black people to wear condoms over and over again. That is
Right.
important, but there is also more that we're doing, and there's also more that we can strive for besides just overcoming these negative statistics that we explored earlier.
Right. And I think that is a great note to end on, actually, is that we are sex positive.
Mm-hmm.
We are, we're all for the pleasure and we're all for the passion, but we're not with the pain, like, if unless it's consensual in the
Right.
bed.
Yes,
'Cause,
absolutely. Sex
yeah.
positive, but really, I like to think of myself as someone who's pleasure positive and
Pleasure
trying to
positive.
make that accessible to Black people because, like we started talking about, sometimes we are working with misinformation or information that's not fully developed. And so, when we can have more conversations like these, when people can follow Instagram pages like mine and other people who are doing work in this space to start gaining new perspectives, I think that we have the ability to work past some of these negative statistics, but to also work towards something beyond that. So I love ending on this note.
Yes. And also, with that being said, for the woman in the room, Maya wrote an article for, they were in here too, G Spot Coaching.
Mm-hmm.
It was a love letter to Black women dating. So just tell us where we can find that. It was a really lovely article. It gave me some more stuff that I'm gonna talk to you about later, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yes, thank you so much, G Spot Coaching, for giving me the platform to convey that message. It's one that's very near and dear to me, and it's an article just kind of exploring some of the dynamics that Black women have to navigate while we're dating, and just encouraging us to be able to do the inner work, to have the experiences while dating that we want to have, and not being so consumed by the external stereotypes that we have to navigate, but trying to discover who we are so that we can attract people who are attracted to us as we are. So that's what that article is about, and you can find that over at G Spot Coaching's website. They also have it on in a link in their Instagram bio. And while you're over there, definitely check out their content because I've learned a lot from following them as well.
Awesome. And thank you so, so, so much again, Maya. These last 3 weeks have been really great and really um, just in alignment with, the stuff that I'm trying to put out there. My platform is smaller, but, the audience is the audience. So thank you for that and for sharing, what you know and stuff like that. I
Yeah,
appreciate
this
it.
was great. All right, I'll see you all next week.
Yes. Next week. See you guys.